Hi, this video is going to be somewhat of a follow-up to a recent video that I uploaded a few days ago, where I talk about descriptive combat or combat description as a tactical advantage in role-playing games. I also talk about how combat can reveal some information and clues about your adversaries and allies. I'm going to put a link in the description to that video. And in that video, I got a couple of comments, one from Marco from the Multiverso Distopico channel. The link to his channel will be in the description as well. And I also got a comment from Yuri. Now, Yuri said an interesting thing, that when you try to describe combat, at least as in the way that I talked about in that video, combats take too long. I think that's an interesting point to explore. Marco also agreed on that. I'm also going to put a link in the description to a video where I talk about combat as a storytelling opportunity. I also mentioned how let's say the pros and cons of lengthy combats or speedy combats. It depends on the role-playing game, the theme, the pacing that you want to handle in a particular session. But I kept thinking if there was some way to achieve a balance, because Yuri mentioned that he's currently designing his own RPG system. He's striving for that balance of combat and other activities, that combat doesn't take too long. I also want to talk about how you can use combat description in a tactical way in solo role-playing games, because there's a bit to it. Some finer points when it comes to not cheating yourself or cheating the system when you play a solo RPG and you want things to be descriptive in battle so that you get some bonuses or advantages in combat. Let's start with the question of combat speed. Personally, I actually enjoy lengthy combats. And depending on the system, this is easier or harder to achieve, both mechanically and thematically. Because, for example, in the Defiant role-playing game, I'm also going to put a link in the description to that review of the core rulebook. If you watched my review of that system, you see that combat is quite fast. It is resolved with a single roll. You just take into account different modifiers and elements, and you make your roll, and that decides the entire combat. That's it. I think there are also other systems that handle combat somewhat speedily with a single roll. So in those cases, it pays off, or it is convenient for you to have combats that are not exactly lengthy, that perhaps just take a small portion of the entire session, because you have subsystems and other mechanics that deal with diplomacy, stealthy maneuvers, intrigue, world building or kingdom building. So in that case, I think that combats that do not last too long, it's actually a good thing for the game. But then I started to think that when I run a role-playing game with others or solo, we do not take too long when it comes to describing the different attacks and maneuvers and strategies. And I was thinking on how to pinpoint exactly why that happens, why description doesn't stretch the length of the combat. So first, I went back to how combats are so rich when it comes to storytelling. Because let's say that you're playing a sci-fi role-playing game, perhaps Necropolis, and you have all of these things happening at the same time. Maybe you have someone saying like, "Sir, the Rephaim are attacking us," and there's another guy with this huge flamethrower. He's like, "Come on, let me at them. I will burn them to a crisp," or something. And the commander is, "No, you stay on the right flank. Jefferson will take care of that." And maybe there are two other soldiers, and they are under heavy fire, taking cover. And one of them is like, "I swear, Tom, if we escape, if we get out of this alive, I'm going to pay you what I owe you." And Tom is like, "Oh, don't worry, Bill. I just took some money from you. this morning to buy this or that, and he's going to be like, what? And so you start to see how that character, those backgrounds come together, they mesh during the fight. And despite being an encounter purely focused on battle, you see so many things that come to light or are revealed from the different personalities of the characters involved in that fight. Maybe one character reveals that he had a loved one or a friend or a rival that was eliminated when fighting the Rephaim, or maybe someone else talks about his lucky weapon, or how he lost a certain, maybe a finger during this fight or that confrontation. So even though it's completely focused on combat, if that session is completely combat heavy, you still have a lot of opportunities to explore the backgrounds and the personal histories of each character. And so lengthy combats, I think they are a good thing if you're focused on that sort of theme and story. But then I thought, so the key to shorten a combat while keeping the description alive is giving some powerful or significant bonuses and advantages while you are describing the attacks. So maybe you are coming up with some really involved description on how your character was fighting this armored ogre of sorts, and he runs at the ogre, and at the last moment he makes like a dive or a slide between the ogre's legs, and he just stabs upwards. Maybe that would give you a huge bonus when it comes to the damage and the attack roll. So combats truly end when a force or one of the sides participating in the battle is completely destroyed, or several of the groups or factions involved in the battle. So as soon as one side is eliminated, the combat ends. Maybe they all die, or maybe they decided to flee from the battlefield. So as long as you give really significant, important bonuses when it comes to your combat description, the battles will end. This is something that I think should have been given more attention in the earlier days of role-playing games, rather earlier years or perhaps even decades, because there are some enemies that have a lot of hit points. If we go back to Dungeons and Dragons and many different retro clones and pseudo clones later on, you have these enemies with perhaps even hundreds of hit points, and it just takes too long to defeat that enemy. If you are piling up against that enemy, you have the entire party casting spells and attacking, it's not going to take too long. But if there are several of those enemies, or if there is this one huge enemy with so many hundreds of hit points, then battles can become a bit tedious. And you usually solve those situations, and I learned that throughout the years without someone telling me. That is, I had to come up with some solutions, giving those, like I said, important advantages or bonuses that makes sense with the description of what the player characters are doing. Because let's take a good example, Conan the Barbarian. Whenever he fights a huge monster, he's not thinking that he's just going to be cutting away all the time. He's not going to spend half an hour hacking and slashing against that monster, that huge aberration, or it could be any monster that you can imagine, because Conan fights against demons and these creatures from the depths, and so many colossal enemies, and a lot of them he defeats them using his intelligence, his wolfish cunning, so to speak, or his pantherish attitude. Some of them he manages to topple them down some pit or abyss. Some others he identifies a very specific weakness, and he uses a certain object. He usually throws a lot of objects against his enemies. They could be giant spiders, they could be demons. He takes an object that it either just bluntly damages the enemy, or it's an object made of some sort of material that pretty much spells the end of that enemy. Conan will throw it against that enemy. And if we were to translate that into Dungeons and Dragons terms, that could deal perhaps dozens of hit points at the same time, just using that method. So maybe your character is fighting this huge dragon and he decides to create some sort of structural damage so that these many stones or huge wooden poles that more than anything resembles huge stakes, they fall over the dragon, then that's going to deal a lot of damage for that dragon. So there are many things that you can do with good combat description. And even if you are fighting an opponent that is not that big and not that over the top, depending on how the attack is being described, like I said, give your players good bonuses. Perhaps if it's a really good idea, very good description, +4 or +5 in the attack, and you deal an automatic additional 5 points of hit points of damage. And it's all about that. The description has to match the benefit of that combat action. And so, in the case of what you mentioned, Yuri, if you are still thinking of ways of on modifying your combat system, that would be a good way to do it. But that's just my opinion. Maybe you have already thought of many other things. But in my case, I would add some heavy combat bonuses to deal so much damage based on the description and just on the attack roll. Another thing that could be a way to speed up things would be an escalation die mechanic of sorts, like many of you that have played 13th Age, which I consider to be the real Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. You have that escalation die, and as the battle progresses, round after round, the escalation die will go up and it will add to the attack roll of the party. So it becomes easier and easier for them to deal considerable damage each round to their enemies. And eventually the battle ends because they have annihilated the enemies, or the enemies simply abandoned the battlefield because things were not going in their favor. So yes, I think that anyone who wants to add combat description to their battles, and so that description has a significant impact on the fight itself, should handle those huge bonuses and additional damage when the attack hits. I think that's the reason why sometimes when you are familiar with some of the heavier or crunchier systems like Hackmaster, when it comes to Hackmaster, you have that possibility that you may end up killing your opponent right away because you dealt so much damage with the exploding dice mechanic, perhaps because of a critical hit. Perhaps the enemy passes out from the pain and it's quite easy for you to finish that enemy off with a coup de grace when the enemy is down. So lethality, I think that's it. Lethality is essential to speed up combat. The more description that exists in a fight, the more lethal, or the greater the potential lethality of that description should take place in that fight. Now, moving on to the other thing that I wanted to talk about is combat description in a solo role-playing game. When you are playing a solo RPG, maybe you are playing as a player character with an emulated game master, or as a game master with an emulated player character, or emulated player characters as I have described in detailed in my Abraham's Method video. I'm also going to put a link in the description to that video. Sometimes you may feel like you are cheating. Maybe you come up with this awesome, cool description, amazing details when it comes to your attacks and your maneuvers and your defenses, and you are giving that character some huge bonuses when it comes to attack and damage, and you may be thinking that, oh, I'm just putting things too easy or too much in my favor. I think there are two ways to handle that, or two possible ways. There could be others, but in my case, first, I think that it's always worth it to give those bonuses based on description to your own player character or to the emulated player character, because player characters have it really rough when it comes to adventures. That is, when it comes to the obstacles, the hazards, the traps, the enemies that they will be facing. So they already have so much on their plate. They do not need additional hardships when it comes to getting penalized because of a cool combat description. So I think you shouldn't be too hard on yourself. And if you think that you came up with a very cool description of an attack, of a maneuver, defensive tactic, whatever, apply those bonuses. Your character will need it. And later on, there are going to be so many other dangers. And it adds to the flavor of the story. Many of those amazing fantasy heroes, Conan the Barbarian, Drizzt Do'Urden, Aragorn, all of those, they do so many cool things in battle. And it simply it makes sense with the story and the theme. Another way to handle this, I learned it from the when I first familiarized myself with the Deluxe Tunnels and Trolls core rulebook. I'm also going to put the link in the description to that review. They give you a notion of combat stunts. You are encouraged to use your skills so that you get some advantages during battle. Because Tunnels and Trolls is an action comedy sort of experience, you can come up with some pretty crazy ideas. You are not restricted to uh, physically based or physically oriented skills. Maybe you are thinking you can only use things related to athletics or acrobatics when it comes to moving around your opponent and targeting vital areas and such in Deluxe Tunnels and Trolls, because like I said, it's an action comedy experience. You could come up with some crazy ideas. For example, maybe your character he's a really skilled painter, and you could be thinking, how is that going to directly or bluntly affect combat? Maybe the player comes up with an idea that before the fight starts, he knows the types of enemies that they're going to face, and maybe they are fighting a tribe of savages that consider the color red to be quite unlucky. So the character paints some like really scary face on his own skin, like a paint mask or of sorts, and he just starts fighting against those savages with this face that resembles the face of a red demon. And maybe he makes his saving roll, to see if the skill use is successful, and if it is, he perhaps deals additional damage because the enemies are intimidated and they don't fight as skillfully as they normally would. Or maybe the enemies lose some combat adds because of the, like I said, they are too intimidated because of the unlucky red demonic face that they are viewing or watching. Hmm. Or maybe your character is quite knowledgeable when it comes to plants. Maybe he has a high skill of botanics or botany or something. So during a fight in a jungle or in a forest, he says, I'm going to try to identify some plant in the area that will help me in some way during this fight. So the character makes the roll and it is successful, and the game master is, aha, yes, there is this strange plant known as the mm, slippery tangleroot. And this plant is not only quite slippery if you step on it, it's all tangled up and your foot really gets trapped if you step on it. So maybe the character actually managed to maneuver his enemy upon a patch of that tangle root, and because of that, the enemy cannot use his shield effectively or his armor, and it is easier to damage the enemy. But you could be thinking, that could still pull things or arrange things in favor of the player character a bit too much. Well, in the Troll Zine number 1, if I remember correctly, it's a free magazine for the Deluxe Tunnels and Trolls. The link will be in the description. When it comes to Troll Zine, they go a bit deeper into the use of skills for combat stunts. So in order for you to feel like you are not cheating, that you are not playing the system in the favor of the player character, there could be a penalty if you miss your roll, if it's not a successful check. So maybe you use some skill that allows you to bypass completely the shield and the armor of the opponent. Maybe you attempt some sort of crazy flip. Maybe your character is quite acrobatic and you are fighting in a cave where there are many stalactites and stalagmites and rocky formations, and you want your character to suddenly climb on top of a rock and just do like a flip behind his opponent to backstab him immediately. You could make your roll, and if you are successful, you bypass the protection of the opponent, or you reduce the combat adds by half, and you deal damage. But if you fail, your backflip is simply too clumsy. Maybe you fall on your back or something, and now the enemy deals additional damage. I really recommend that you read the Troll zines. There are some ways that they also offer some tips speaking about speeding up combat that actually speed up the typical Tunnels and Trolls battle. Because in Tunnels and Trolls you roll so many dice at the same time, but you do have some equivalencies there to handle good damage as averages, so that you only roll a few dice and the rest of the damage is an average quantity that always applies, or average value that always applies during each round. So yes, those are my thoughts when it comes to speeding up combat and using combat description in a solo role-playing game. I hope you found this informative and entertaining. I'm currently working on the next part of my Slugfest review. If you haven't seen that one, it's a really cool solo and co-op superhero skirmish game. The link will be in the description. So I hope I will release that this week if possible, with a complete battle report so you can see how the game works at a basic level. So thank you for watching, and thank you so much to those that have been supporting the channel by sending Drive-Thru RPG gift certificates. If anyone else wants to further support the channel, the information how to do that will be in the description below. Once again, thank you, and thank you to Yuri and Marco for your comments. It really served to come up with some interesting ideas when it comes to speeding up combat and combat description as well. Once again, thank you, and see you later.